end of the 2nd century AD, a Roman soldier, Tiberius Claudius Vitellius, crossed the river Danube and left the civilized world behind him. Trained to obey, he never thought to question the order to march into the unknown. In the war to come, victory would depend upon such unflinching discipline. It was the greatest weapon of the greatest army that the world had ever seen. At the height of its power, Rome, the greatest empire in the world, was paying tribute to barbarians. In 85 AD, descending from their mountain strongholds north of the lower Danube, the Dacians had raided the imperial province of Moesia. 2 Roman legions were sent against them. Both were destroyed. It was not until 88 AD that Rome's pride was restored by victory over the Dacians at the Battle of Tapae. But with Rome threatened by an outbreak of fighting in the neighboring province of Pannonia, the Emperor Domitian decided to come to terms with the Dacians. One of them was the payment of an annual subsidy. Now in 101 AD, 4 years after assuming power, Emperor Trajan set about dealing with the fractious Dacians once and for all. His force numbered 12 legions, 57,000 men, more than a third of the whole Roman army. One of the legionaries who followed him to war was a 30-year-old veteran, Tiberius Claudius Vitellius. As a boy of 17 from Rome, Tiberius had sworn an oath of allegiance to the emperor. Ever since, the army had been his home. He had already given his youth to his country. Now, a dozen more years of service of the 25 he had signed on for loomed before him. At the outset, life in the army had beguiled him with the promise of status and adventure, not to mention regular pay. Now, he was interested only in survival. Of every 2 legionaries he marched with, only one would live out his term. With an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Europe to the shores of the Black Sea, it was hardly surprising that Rome was constantly at war. In the beginning, conquests had been made by part-time soldiers. By the time of Christ, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, rested on the swords of the legions, an army of professionals. From its humble origins, as a village of mud huts on an Italian hillside, Rome had become the greatest city in the world. A capital of 1 million people, ruling an empire of 60 million. This was the world through Roman eyes, a civilized land surrounded by barbarians who never ceased to bay and gnaw at its borders. Tiberius was stationed on the frontier where the barbarians' bark was at its loudest. His legion, the 5th Macedonia, took its name from the province in which he had been raised. Now it was based to the north, below the river Danube, the border between the Roman province of Moesia and the Dacian wilderness. It was to protect the outer limits of the empire and to put down uprisings within that men like Tiberius had been trained. A Jew who observed legionaries in Judea discovered the key to their success.
They do not wait for war to begin before handling their arms, nor do they sit idle in peacetime. But as if born ready armed, they never have a break from training. It would not be far from the truth to call their drills bloodless battles, their battles bloody drills. That is why they stand so easily the strain of battle. No indiscipline dislodges them from their formation. No panic incapacitates them. No toil wears them down. So victory over men not so trained follows as a matter of course.
When young Tiberius enlisted, he spent the first 6 months drilling twice a day. Mock battles with wicker shields and wooden swords, twice as heavy as the real weapons, and wielded just as harshly. "13 years later, he still drilled daily and ran 4 kilometers. 3 times a month, he went on a route march, a trek of 32 kilometers in full armor and equipment, whatever the weather. At full pace, this distance could be covered in just over 4 hours. The legionary earned his nickname of Mule. When Tiberius set out to fight the Dacians, he was weighed down with weapons, armor, and shield, but he also carried an axe, a pick, a saw, 3 days' rations, and a forked pole to convey his personal effects and mess equipment. The legion was accompanied by all the professions a soldier might need: blacksmiths and bookkeepers, vets and doctors. It also had surveyors and pioneers, and they began the war against the Dacians by building. Taking up the tools of stonemasons and carpenters, they constructed a chain of forts to guard their line of supply against Dacian raids. Behind these walls, city-bred men like Tiberius immersed themselves in the comforts of home. Their officers encouraged them to take part in martial pastimes like wrestling. But they also indulged in the vices of all soldiers: drink and dice, and other diversions. Marriage was forbidden, but in practice, legionaries would find wives or mistresses among the locals. Letters were sent home, both mundane and melancholy.
Send beans, chickens, 100 apples if you can find nice ones, 100 or 200 eggs if they are for sale at a fair price, fish sauce, olives. Cratius de Veldeus, his brother, an old messmate. Very many greetings. And I ask you, brother Veldeus, I am surprised that you have written nothing back to me for such a long time, whether you've heard anything from our elders. Best wishes to our sister.
As a dozen legions concentrated on the south bank of the Danube, the Dacians withdrew to their main defences in the passes that led to their capital in the Transylvanian mountains. The legions prepared to follow. Emperor Trajan summoned his officers for a final council. As Trajan's army made its final preparations for the Dacian campaign, livestock was sacrificed to the gods and priests reared their entrails for omens. They were good. The Romans crossed the Danube into western Dacia in two great columns, one led by the emperor himself. The plan was to march on two fronts towards the mountains that marked the boundary of Dacia proper. Forced to trudge through a dense forest that was as unsuitable for travel as it was for the Roman way of fighting, the legions made slow progress behind their tree-felling pioneers. At dusk, there was yet more work to be done. As the Dacian spies looked on, the legionaries set about constructing a temporary camp.
Whenever they invade hostile territory, they rigidly refuse to do battle until they have fortified their camp. This they do not construct haphazardly. If the ground is uneven, it is thoroughly leveled. Then the site is marked out as a rectangle. In the gaps between the towers, they mount spear throwers, catapults, stone throwers, and every type of ordnance, all ready to be discharged. The fortifications completed, the men go to their quarters unit by unit in a quiet and orderly fashion. Nothing whatever is done without orders. All other duties are carried out with attention to discipline and security. Wood, food, and water, as required, being brought in by the units detailed.
At the end of a long day, the 8 men of Tiberius's squad pitched their tent and prepared a Spartan meal. If they were resourceful, they supplemented this with whatever they could catch. Then most bedded down in their long cloaks. The rest took up their watch, and woe betide him that fell asleep. If he was lucky, he would escape with a whipping by an officer. If he was not, he would be stoned to death by his comrades. After many days of slow and cautious progress, the 2 Roman columns, each more than 30 kilometers long, joined at Tepiscum. Here Trajan paused, sending his cavalry forward to find the enemy and flush out ambushes. Most of these horsemen were auxiliaries recruited from conquered lands. Only a citizen of Rome could serve in a Roman legion. But the prize of citizenship could be won by an auxiliary, either by completing 25 years' service or by an act of outstanding bravery. At Tapae, the entrance to the Iron Gate Pass, the horsemen discovered the entire Dacian army. Trajan gave the order to prepare for battle. After weeks of marching, cutting trees, and building forts, Tiberius and his comrades relished the chance to fight. Tiberius went into combat, better armored than any soldier of his time. The mail worn by his predecessors had been replaced by the lorica segmentata, a breastplate of overlapping iron scales, fastened by hooks and straps and conforming to his joints. When he moved, so did his armor, unless rusted by rain. He also wore an iron helmet with side flaps that protected his face and neck without obscuring his vision. Tiberius took his place on the battlefield. His unit of 8 formed a squad. 10 such squads formed a century, commanded by a centurion. 6 centuries formed a cohort, and 10 cohorts formed a legion. A total of 4,800 men. Trajan had 12 such legions at his disposal. No such discipline and structure was evident on the opposing side. Wielding long scythes, the Dacians needed room to use them. Within their cohort, each man would fight alone. Tiberius might fight heroically, but never singly. He was an integral cog in a huge military machine. To the 7 men beside him, he was friend as well as a comrade. To the Emperor Trajan, a legion was like one creature trained to act and obey in a single body.
So complete is their submission to their superiors, that in the field the whole army is a single body, so knit together are their ranks.
As the Dacians brandished their weapons and hurled their insults, Tiberius and his comrades advanced in silence. Once in range, they flung their javelins, known as pilums, with long iron necks tempered just behind the head and halfway down the shank. They would bend on becoming lodged in a target, making it useless to the enemy and difficult to withdraw from flesh and bone. Then, wielding his gladius, a short stabbing sword with a wide blade, Tiberius met his foe. Slashing and thrusting, both sides fought until they could fight no more. Then, by agreement, they rested. Soon they resumed the bloody struggle. And so it went on, until eventually the Dacians turned and fled into forested mountains, obstacles that broke up the Roman formations and prevented a pursuit. The legionaries had won the battle, but not the campaign. They had failed to take the Dacian capital. With winter approaching, Trajan was content to maintain his advanced position with a screen of troops. The rest were marched back to winter quarters below the Danube. But Decebalus, the Dacian king, used the respite to launch a raid of his own in the lower Moesa, prompting Trajan to decide on Dacia. The campaign got underway in the spring of 102 AD, and within weeks, Trajan's eastern army had penetrated the Red Tower Pass. The Dacians now abandoned the field and retreated to their mountain strongholds that ringed their capital. Their strength would now be tested by a Roman siege. Trajan brought up his artillery, arrow-firing ballistae and rock-throwing catapultae, not to dent the Dacians' battlements, but to clear them. Under this barrage of missiles and the hail from slingers and archers, few Dacians dared show their heads, so few saw what came next. Holding their shields over their heads, the legionaries advanced towards the walls in the tortoise-like formation they called the testudo. Within it, Tiberius was almost blind, but well nigh invincible.
To such a great extent are they perfectly protected that both javelins from above are received as if on a roof, and stones large enough to fill a wagon do not break apart the bond, but rolling down by their momentum, fall to the ground.
Worn down by such skillful and relentless onslaughts, the Dacian strongholds were taken one by one. When the last and most stubbornly defended Monsul Citate fell, and the relieving army was defeated, the way to the capital lay open, and the war was won. King Decebalus agreed to sign a treaty of peace that left him his throne, but also a permanent Roman garrison in his capital. No sooner had the main Roman army left, however, than he set about breaking the terms of the treaty. Finally, in 106 AD, Trajan returned and reconquered Dacia after a vicious campaign. Preferring death to dishonor, Decebalus and many of his subordinates committed suicide. This time, Dacia was incorporated into the Roman Empire. Tens of thousands of Dacians were killed or driven from their lands, their place taken by Roman citizens. When in time they left, Dacia had come to be called Romania. The odds on a legionary surviving 25 years of service were at best even. But if he did survive, he would be granted a farm on land he had fought for. There he might live out his days in comfort and honor, bearing his scars to family and neighbors, and recalling his hours of peril and moments of glory. For their valor, the bravest legionaries were rewarded with armbands and medals. Other honors included higher ranks or better posting. Tiberius was among those so favored. He was sent to Legion I, Italica, the most prestigious formation in the Roman army. How his life ended, by accident, disease, or the sword, is unknown. Only that it was untimely. At the age of 41, with just one more year to spend in the service of Rome, he died.